On October 13, 1972, a twin-engine turboprop carrying 45 people vanished into the Andes Mountains. For 72 days, the world believed everyone on board was dead. Then 2 emaciated men in rags stumbled out of the snow and into the history books. They had walked for 10 days across the highest peaks in the Western Hemisphere. They had no mountaineering gear, no training, no food. They wore rugby boots wrapped in airplane seat cushions. What they had done to survive had never been spoken aloud, but it would become the most famous story of human endurance ever told. I want to tell you what happened at 10,000 feet. How 16 people stayed alive for 2.5 months in a frozen metal tube, and the choice they made that still divides anyone who hears this story. Uruguayan Air Force, Flight 571, was a chartered flight carrying the Old Christians rugby team. The players were university students from Montevideo. Some brought family members. A few friends joined at the last minute. The flight was supposed to take 4 hours. Montevideo to Santiago, a straight shot over the Andes. The pilot was an experienced Air Force colonel, but he made a fatal calculation error in the mountain pass. He began his descent too early, believing the plane had already cleared the Andes. The aircraft slammed into a ridge at 11,000 feet. The wings sheared off. The tail section broke away. The remaining fuselage slid down a glacier at more than 200 miles per hour. It came to rest in a bowl of snow surrounded by towering peaks on every side. White mountains rose to 15,000 feet in every direction. No roads, no trails, no sign of human life for hundreds of miles. 12 people died on impact. 5 more died during the first freezing night. 28 survivors huddled together in the wreckage of the crushed fuselage. The temperature at night dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The fuselage had no heat. The survivors had summer clothing and a few bottles of wine. They tore the seat covers off to use as blankets. They melted snow in aluminum panels torn from the aircraft to drink. They rationed the tiny amounts of food they found in the luggage. A chocolate bar divided into paper-thin slices. A jar of jam shared among 28 people over 8 days. On the 8th day, the last of the food was gone. The survivors were starving to death at 10,000 feet. They could see search planes flying overhead, but the white fuselage was invisible against the white snow. The planes passed over again and again. The survivors waved and screamed. No one saw them. On the 10th day, they heard on a small transistor radio that the search had been called off. The world had given them up for dead. That was the day they made the choice. The bodies of their dead friends and teammates lay preserved in the snow outside the fuselage. The survivors were starving. The only source of protein on the mountain was the dead. They made a pact. If any of them died, the others could use their bodies to survive. Then they went outside and did what hunger demanded. I am not going to describe the details of what happened next. You know what happened, but I want you to understand what it meant. These were deeply Catholic young men. They believed they would be damned for what they were doing. Some could not bring themselves to do it at first and simply lay in the snow waiting to die. Others reasoned that the dead had already left their bodies. What remained was just matter, flesh and protein that could keep a living heart beating. They prayed before every meal that no one should ever have to pray before. On the 17th day, an avalanche buried the fuselage while the survivors slept. 8 more people died. The survivors were trapped under 6 feet of packed snow inside the fuselage for 3 days before they could dig their way out. Now there were 19 left, buried alive, eating the dead, watching for planes that never came back. Nando Parado was one of the survivors. His mother and sister had both died in the crash. He had been unconscious for 3 days after the impact. When he woke up, his family was gone. He made a decision. He would not die in that fuselage. He would walk out of the mountains or die trying. Roberto Canessa was a 20-year-old medical student. He had been the one treating the wounded, setting broken bones with no supplies, keeping people alive with nothing but his hands and his voice. Canessa understood what the trek would require. He calculated the distances. He knew the risks. He also knew that waiting meant certain death for everyone. On December 12th, Parado and Canessa set out with a third survivor named Antonio Vizintin. They had improvised a sleeping bag from the aircraft insulation. They carried dried meat that no one wanted to name. They climbed westward. The peaks were higher than anything they had imagined. The air was so thin that every step felt like drowning. They climbed a peak that took 3 days, and from the summit they saw nothing but more mountains stretching to the horizon. Vizintin turned back. Parado and Canessa kept going. What they accomplished over the next 7 days defies every rule of mountaineering. They climbed 15,000-foot peaks with no ropes or ice axes. They crossed glaciers in tennis shoes. They descended sheer rock faces using their frozen hands. On December 20th, after 9 days of walking, Canessa spotted something in the distance. A river valley with green grass. A dirt road. A man on a horse on the far side of the river. They had reached Chile. The man on the horse could not understand them at first. The sound of the river was too loud. He gestured for them to wait and returned the next morning with food. Parado and Canessa had walked 60 miles across the spine of the Andes. They had ascended and descended more vertical feet than any trained mountaineer would attempt without gear. They weighed less than 100 pounds each. On December 22nd, helicopters lifted off from Santiago. Canessa guided them back through the peaks to the crash site. The pilots could not believe what they were flying into. The remaining 14 survivors saw the helicopters appear over the ridge. They fell to their knees in the snow. Some wept. Some simply stared, unable to process that the nightmare was ending. 16 people survived 72 days in the Andes. They were rescued on December 23, 1972. The story was called The Miracle of the Andes. But it was not a miracle. It was human will pushed past every limit. 16 ordinary people made choices that no human being should ever have to make. They ate the flesh of the dead to stay alive. They watched their friends die one by one. They climbed mountains that professional guides still refuse to attempt. And they came home. The Catholic Church issued a ruling that the survivors had committed no sin. Their act was one of necessity, not desecration. The families of the dead embraced the survivors when they returned. No one condemned them. Every year the survivors gather at the crash site. They bring their children and grandchildren. They stand at 10,000 feet and remember the ones who did not come down. What stays with me about the Andes story is not the horror of the choice they made. It is the clarity of it. 28 people looked at a situation with no good options and chose the one that kept them alive. They did not debate philosophy. They did not ask permission from a God they could not hear on the mountain. They made a decision, and they lived with it. Parado wrote later that the mountains taught him something simple. Dying is easy. Living is the hard part. Every single day you choose to live is a victory over everything that wants to stop you. 16 people chose to live. They chose it in the dark of a frozen fuselage. They chose it with empty stomachs and broken bones. They chose it by walking into mountains that had already killed their friends. That kind of choice does not belong to saints or heroes. It belongs to ordinary people who refuse to accept that this is where their story ends.